off your revision on language paper 1A, and I'm just going to focus on questions 3 and 4 today, mainly because I think you can probably all do question 1, or I hope you can anyway, and I know you're pretty good at question 2, which is the language one. Okay, and then on Friday we'll do some creative writing, as it says there. So can you start off by copying your title, date and learning objective into your books? You can hit pause if you want, and then when you've done that, just start it off going. You should also have been sent an extract from a novel called The Silent Land. Please can you read that? Thank you. Okay, all done? So, another time for a little bit of work on your own. Can you please, if you're able to print out the extract, can you do so? And then if you're not, of course, just jot some notes down in your book, but particularly with this question in mind, which is a structure question. So, this text is from the beginning of a novel. How has the writer structured this text to interest you as a reader? You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops, and any other structural features that interest you. As I say, just take perhaps 5 minutes or so on that, and if you want to hit pause and then start this playing again once you've done that. Okay, so hopefully you might have noticed some of the following. These are just a few things that I noticed. My purple are my structural annotations. Do you remember I always say to you it's worth having 2 different colours when you annotate? So the first thing is the ironic foreshadowing, as I've said there. So she almost thought she could die in that place, and the silence is described as a pre-echo of death. Now obviously structurally that's interesting, because when you get to the very end of the extract, well, we don't know where this has ended, but it certainly seems doesn't seem to end very cheerfully. So that's perhaps the first structural device that I might pick up on. Secondly, I hope you might have noticed the motif of sound that runs throughout this. So it's a very silent opening. The gentle snowflakes. I suppose just the silence really. As we go through, that silence becomes a whisper, and then we're quite explicitly told the whisper is displaced by a rumble. The rumble became louder, and then even further, the rumbling had become a roaring, and as you can see here, this just gets progressively louder as we move through until we return, and you get that lovely comparison with the beginning of the silence. And you might talk about perhaps the way that the sound is used to raise the tension to a high point and then suddenly drop it, almost leaving the reader quite unfulfilled. And the final structural point that I picked up on was 2 more actually. Sorry. So obviously we got to the clear turning point, which is the word "but." And if you do see a paragraph starting with the word "but," that's usually your turning point. You can't just say, of course, there is a turning point. The important thing is the difference between vocabulary from beginning to an end, with that being the midpoint, really. And I think it becomes much more aggressive as you move forwards from here. You get things like punched and the like. Okay, and now lastly, the final structural device, which I think is quite interesting, and I really like this actually, is the use of dramatic irony and the difference between what the reader knows and what our protagonist seems to know. So, somewhere around about here, we as readers begin to realise that this is an avalanche, and yet Zoe is still very unaware of this. It makes her smile. So very effective dramatic irony here, and this interests the reader because we're waiting for the tension. We know what's going to happen, but she doesn't. So we're waiting for that. And yeah, it's as you can see, it's literally only here when she becomes aware that there is an avalanche. Okay, so just to recap, so Three structural devices I've noticed, you may have noticed others, I hope you have, are the strong motif of the escalating sound and then drop back to silence. That clear turning point at line 28, which divides the text, and then the use of dramatic irony, where we know more than the protagonist. Okay, so I want to give you time to have a go at answering this question now. Now remember, for this question it's okay to start your paragraph by identifying the device and then going on to illustrate it rather than starting with the idea. But all you need to remember at all times is to use your structural terminology, things like narrative voice, narrative perspective, motif, this kind of thing, wherever possible. It really doesn't matter how you structure your answers here or how you write them. So keep it nice and simple. Something like this might get you started. So the first way Joyce has used structure deliberately to interest the reader is his use of, and off you go. So I'll give you 10 minutes just to write a response to that. If you can hit pause and then just start this playing again when you've done your answer. Okay, so hopefully now you've done that answer, I'd like to just do a little bit of self-assessment now, please. So you don't need to print this out. I know previously we've glued these into your books. You don't need to do that. But if you could just use this to try and give yourself a mark out of 8, you know how these things work hopefully by now. So just work along and just see if you can give yourself a mark out of 8. And then what I would like, I've just noticed a spelling mistake. What I would like you to do, please, is then set yourself a target once you've done so. So again, pause the video while you assess your work, and then now, as I say, just set yourself a target. How might you improve in the future? And like I say, my top tip there is to talk about how the narrative voice is used to create dramatic irony. I think this is a really, really good thing to look for. Okay, so that's the structure question. I want to move on now to look at evaluation if we have time. Now we may not have time to go all the way through this. I don't want you to work over the hour that you would normally spend. But there is your structure question. You should be familiar with these. So focus your answer on the second part of the source, line 28 to the end. A student said, "In this part of the story, where Zoe and Jake are caught in the avalanche, I can't believe Zoe is so slow to react to the warning signs because, in the end, the situation sounds really dangerous. To what extent do you agree?" And you've got your tips there. Okay, so in your books, I can ask you, fill in a full page. Can you draw that usual grid? Look back in your books if you don't know what I'm talking about. That usual grid to evaluate the writer's use of characterization and setting. And I just want to ask you, really, which two parts of this question will you use as the headers for your grid? And again, just pause the video while you put that into your book and fill that in. Okay, so hopefully your grid might look something like this. This was what I came up with. So Zoe is so slow to react to the warning signs, and the situation sounds really dangerous. And I tried to sort of think about how Zoe, how her character is very naive, perhaps, or maybe how her character is contrasted with Jake's character. Okay. So here's a few things that might be useful for you in your answer to question 4. We start at line 28, don't we? Okay. So here we go. So she's characterised almost as quite petty, irritated by the false start. It's quite a petty attitude to take when it's something potentially so drastic. Maybe she seems a little foolish there. I think the way she's contrasted with Jake is interesting. Again, that shows her naivety. And lastly, talk about the language used to describe the setting. Really, I suppose, really when the language becomes much more violent and it really escalates that sense of danger. Okay, so I think you're probably running out of time by now. But as I said, and I don't want you to work over the hour. Please don't feel, because you'll get behind. But if you do have a little bit of time now, could I just ask you to have a go at answering that question 4? Doesn't matter if you don't, but if you do, that would be fantastic. And then the next slide will give you the usual mark grid for you to self-assess your work. So up to 20 minutes writing that response if you have time, or whatever time you've got left. If you've got less than 20 minutes, pause the video just while you answer that. Okay, so on to your assessments. Yeah, again, if you know how these things work, if you can just again pause the video, sorry to keep stopping and starting, pause the video, set yourself give yourself a mark and set yourself a target. Okay, and that is us. So